Hey there, and welcome to That Independent Streak. I'm your host, Wendy Campbell, and I am so glad that you found us. Now, this podcast is for you. If you have ever been accused of being a freethinker, a little bit opinionated, maybe a little bit of a wild child, I've come to realize that all of those labels, while I think they were meant to dissuade me from behaviors, were actually gifts from the universe, badges of honor that really come down to this. Being on a bandwagon is lazy. Accepting everything that you're told is really boring. Free thought is a privilege, and we're going to need a heck of a lot more people to realize that. Now, that said, this is intentionally a place for health, wellness, travel, and life, especially if you've lived one. I put this channel together to create a place where we women over 40 could continue to share the knowledge of our sisters and mothers and pass that on down to our children and grandchildren. It's a place where we discuss what matters to us, adventurous and full-spirited as we are at this place in life. And with that, we do discuss all the things. Today's guest came around at a time when I was really actively looking for her knowledge. I decided a few months ago that I was ready to drop some of those old chapters of my youth and really kind of evolve to a place that's more centered and healthy and strong so that I can help those around me work to that place too. So I've been investigating therapies, philosophies, treatments, and science, all the woo, all the religions, all to explore what we have available to us with the technology and the spirituality around us. Dr. Carrie Johansson is a psychologist turned speaker. She's author of Self-Help on the Go, and she's eagerly teaching people how to more easily navigate life's inevitable ups and downs. Now, frankly, I just kind of love her no-nonsense, go-get-it attitude. She's great. So if you're ever thinking about treatment, aging, finding balance in the noise, maybe getting your team a little bit of therapy, all of those things, Dr. Carrie is the woman for the job. Now, we have a wonderful conversation. It covers a few different directions. I had a ton of rapid fire questions, and she answered all of them with grace and ease, and it's kind of inspirational, actually. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do, because I'm taking you along on this exploration for the next few months. If you do, and you make it through to the end, I do encourage you to share it and like this episode. It just helps the show and helps others see it. All of Dr. Carrie's information will be in the show notes, or you can find it on the page at thatindependentstreakpodcast.com. Feel free to come on by, leave any questions or thoughts anywhere you find us on any of the socials, wherever. And with that, Dr. Carrie.
Good morning.
I am so excited to have you on, mostly because this is a topic that I think, at least in my personal life, we've been talking a lot about, mental health. And as we go into this, this sagey kind of post-40 mindset where we're really trying to guide people, I think the most important thing we can do is do it with a healthy set of values and a healthy set of minds and really kind of guide better from a healthier place. So I've been looking forward to this one, but I want you to have the opportunity to kind of tell your story and how you went from 20 years of psychology clinically into what you're doing now.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Well, so I first figured out that my kind of mission in life was to help people when I was a kid. I was the person who was bringing home the bird with the broken wing. I was the person who knew who was being mistreated in high school in their household. And um, my mom and dad both had grown up in very tumultuous households. And so they were quite dedicated to being the safe house for my brother's friends and my friends when we were growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a really beautiful job of that. And um, they really modeled this notion of taking care of yourself and taking care of other people. And when I was in high school, I figured out that I was, the lofty adolescent brain. I was like, I either want to be a social justice lawyer or I want to be a psychologist. Um, and the fun thing is that I actually experimented with law. So I went to college and graduated with a degree in history and a desire to be a lawyer. And then I actually went and worked for a law firm and figured out that it was a terrible fit for me. It was going to be working with paper and not people. And so I went back to school and collected my degrees to become a psychologist. So this desire to help people and this desire to have people feel good in their lives, and for me to feel good in my life, has been just central throughout my existence, I guess. And in private practice, so 22 years in private practice as of November 1st, which was fun.
Congratulations.
And in private practice have specialized in treating anxiety and trauma. But the interesting thing is that a few years ago, I got really passionate about figuring out who gets better and why, because it isn't always really predictable, which I think is fascinating,
That is
right?
fascinating. We're going to
Like
jump
the
into that for
person
sure.
with the most resources isn't necessarily the person who gets better the fastest. It helps. The person with the worst trauma history isn't necessarily the person who takes the longest to get better. So trying to sort through who gets better and why. And I happened upon a theory of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. It is evidence-based, which is great. It builds off of a combination of different therapies, therapy theories, and it feels like the best combination of psychodynamic, which looks at the past and how does that inform your future, solution focused, which is how do you move forward, and narrative, which is what are the stories that you're telling yourself, and then cognitive behavioral. So it puts together all of these big historical models of therapy and puts them in one place.
Hmm.
And that has been really awesome to find that theoretical home. And then from there, I've really had a lot of fun with playing with it. But it's based in a concept called psychological flexibility. And I promise I'll get less technical as
No,
we
I like
talk.
the technicality. I think it's interesting. So continue.
So, psychological flexibility is a fancy term for actually something that, if you slow down and think about it, you probably know it's true. When we are working with the reality that we actually have, we end up having more choices than when we are fighting reality and living in wishful thinking,
Okay.
right? So life doesn't get better when you lose the next 10 pounds. It doesn't get better when you find the perfect boyfriend. It doesn't get better when you know, get out of the terrible relationship or get into, this with your kids or out of that with your kids or fill in the blank, right? Life actually is the very best when we slow down and we work with what we presently have and then set goals for what we'd like to move towards.
Hmm.
But their goals are set from actual reality, not wishful thinking, and not remorse and regret from the past, and also not resistance to what you're in the middle of.
Hmm.
So that acceptance is not approval. This is really important to acknowledge because I think people think, well, if I accept the reality that I'm in, that means that I'm saying yes to whatever the problem experience is. And it's like, no, you're just actually accepting that it's factually there.
Right.
And then you can take a breath and then you can look at it and really divide what's working, what isn't working, what's going well, what isn't going well. And then from there, you have a lot more choices.
Do you think it's hard for, I mean, it took me a long time to understand the difference between accepting where I'm at and understanding where I'm at. Like
Yeah.
just that awareness of like I think a lot of people and I'll include myself like to believe like they're manifesting their reality, right?
Sure.
So there's this thinking of, well, if I'm manifesting my reality and this is my reality, something's broken. And there's I think there's a disconnect between understanding that and also accepting where you're at. So how do you break that down to someone and kind of I'm trying to think of like how do you coach to that? How do you like understand that?
Well, we've kind of forgotten that a couple of different things are true at the same time. So, can you manifest your reality? Sort of, right? Thoughts do become things. And what I mean by that is what we are focused on, we will get um, both bigger intensity and bigger scope of what we focus on. So if we're really focused on a problem, we're going to find out all the little granular details of that problem. And it's also going to feel bigger, right?
Right.
So in the manifestation crowd, they're on to something when they're saying thoughts become things. But what they forget to add is that action is actually the only way to change your thoughts.
Okay.
So you can't just sit around and think and then be really upset that you haven't manifested the perfect life. Also, there's a critical element missing in the manifestation idea,
Hmm.
which is that you can do that A, with no action, and B, that you're going to get to a problem-free life. It's just not the case, right? And so
Right.
it's interesting. I've known whole communities who are based on that sort of science of mind concept, and they end up feeling like failures. And some of these places have had really high suicide rates because people are into this and then they have a problem in their life, and their automatic assumption is that they haven't manifested correctly or that they have manifested this problem.
Mhm.
And then they feel devastated because then they feel like a failure. And so a piece of what I coach is very different, which is like, yes, absolutely. Let's take a look at what we're thinking about and how much room and rein are we giving our thoughts, right?
Right.
It's a little bit like, you know, if you're on a horse and it's running away, you got to actually rein it in, right?
Mhm.
And so our brains are a little bit like naughty horses in our heads. They're always galloping off in silly directions, right? And they get
Sure.
scared about things they don't actually need to be scared about. And honoring that we're scared about something instead of berating ourselves for it is super important.
Mhm.
And then figuring out what the action is to move towards what you want, that is critical. Understanding that you're never going to have a problem-free life. We are all a collection, a unique, lovely mix of our own strengths and weaknesses.
Mhm.
Right? No one's gonna get to a place where they only have strengths and they have no weaknesses. It's just it's not possible, and it's actually not that interesting if it was to really happen.
Right. Right. Truth.
So, figuring out what are your tendencies that move you in good directions? What are your tendencies that move you in negative directions? And then how do you work around them? That's a much more realistic place to come to getting what you want.
Right. Right. Now you had mentioned something when you were breaking things down about kind of the stories people tell themselves
Yeah.
and navigating through some of that muck because I think I mean we're human, but we also like to embellish, right? So that embellishment that we even
Sure.
embellish our own stories, how yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, and often, especially if you have a tendency to run anxious, anxiety will embellish our stories and make everything very scary,
Mhm.
right? Depression will embellish our stories and make everything very hopeless. Anger will embellish our stories and make everything an invitation for a hot-headed response, right?
Right.
So our feelings embellish our stories or our thoughts in our head, not necessarily in very positive ways,
Right.
right?
So that being said though, I think one of the things that people kind of probably want to understand is how do you find the truth, right? And finding the balance between, okay, this is what happened, like
Yep.
this is what really happened. This is the
Yep.
story I tell myself, and this is the story I relay to the rest of the world.
Yep.
So there's a lot of difference in
Oh,
that.
there's so many dynamics in there. And the fun part is when you get into that assessment mode, what really happened? Then there's room for you to say, I don't know what was inside someone else's head. Here's my best guess of what their intention was. But I don't know that when they said this thing that upset me, that that was necessarily what they were going for. Or sometimes it's helpful just to say, so I'm trying to think of a specific example, right? Like, let's say, what's a problem that your audience often has? Give me a
Well, I mean, we're looking at women who typically have lived, a good life, right? They've
yeah,
probably been married, they've been in a career, so there's the work life, there's the kid life, there's the
yep.
marriage life, there's the not marriage life, there's all, you know what I mean? Like there's just all of those things that happen. I mean, you're talking about, 30 years of adult life at this
Yep.
point. So really, it could be anything. It could be like, this is what happened in my relationship. It could be, this is what happened when I did my first job, and this caused me to
Yep.
do this, and therefore I do that. It could be anything, really.
Well, so I'll take an old story. I was actually telling this story last night, so I'll tell this story. So I was a bookworm. I was a
Hmm.
nerd, like capital N, boldface, bright flashing letters, nerd, right? Growing up, more likely you'd find me in a corner with a book than outside, right? Now, my brother was the athlete. He has superb hand-eye coordination. I mean, it's ridiculous. He started playing tennis one summer. I think he was 14. He started playing tennis in like March. He was nationally ranked by August.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then he decided in September that tennis wasn't his thing, and he took up lacrosse, and then, ended up on a college lacrosse scholarship. But like, he was phenomenally coordinated. He was the athlete,
Hmm.
right? I was the bookworm. And this story followed me for a really long time. And this story of, oh, I'm not an athlete. Oh, I have terrible hand-eye coordination. Oh, I could never play sports, right? This was a very loud story in my life with a fair amount of evidence to it,
Hmm.
right? Especially in contrast to my brother, who the evidence of him being an athlete was ridiculous,
Right.
right? So this story, though, at some point didn't end up being very helpful because it meant that I felt like I couldn't do things, right?
Hmm.
And this is the thing about some of our stories is sometimes our stories are really helpful. They give us confidence, they give us, a sense of self-esteem, all of that stuff, but a lot of times our stories kind of keep us small and keep us stuck repeating old patterns that aren't necessarily that useful anymore.
Right.
So when I was turning 40, I was feeling super frumpy, and I felt like I'm going into middle age. It was almost my 40th birthday, and I was like, I'm not going down without a fight, right? I was like, we're going to get into the best shape of our life in our 40s, just for no other reason than just to do it, right?
Hmm.
So I ended up working with a personal trainer, and at some point he says to me, "You're good at lifting. You should compete." And I say, old story, "Oh, I'm not an athlete. I could never compete." He is and, uh, stubborn and powerless, and he actually ended up entering me into a powerlifting meet. He's like, "No, no, you're just gonna do this. You'll just do it for practice. It'll be fine. It'll be fun," right? Enters me into this powerlifting meet, and I go and I do well. And powerlifting is a really cool sport. I can't recommend highly enough for women to get into it because it's so much fun. Being
Hmm.
strong is so empowering. And what an incredibly supportive group. Like, you go to
Right.
a powerlifting meet, and the women, first of all, were like sharing things with each other. Oh, my belt broke. Oh, you can borrow mine, right? Like, oh, I don't have the right socks. Oh, I have socks for you, right? Like, it was so supportive. And more than anything, it's like, did you get your lift? And they're so excited for you to do well for you, and then you get to be so excited for yourself and for your compatriots. It's
Right.
fabulous.
Right. And also super healthy for older women.
And
It's a totally different podcast that we're going to do here in the near future, but women actually our age are, the recommendation is that you lift because it
yes,
strengthens your bones and does all the right things. So that aside.
and lifting well, number 1, is fantastic for your mental health, but strength training translates to cardiovascular fitness in ways that cardio never translates to strength.
Right.
And in particular for older women, it's critical for us. So,
Hmm.
yes, I totally
Yes.
agree.
Yes.
Um,
But I love
but
this
long
group. This community sounds
uh-huh.
fabulous.
So, and powerlifting is divided into gender, weight class, and age. So I was a master's woman competing in a certain kilogram weight class. Um, and there weren't very many women in my category. And I ended up setting state records in Colorado. Now, I have not held those state records. I can no longer lift that much weight. None of those things are still true. But in terms of blasting through that old story,
Hmm.
holy cow, that story doesn't have legs anymore.
So how did that change you? I mean, that changes you on almost like a molecular level, right? Because at that point, you've now broken, it's almost like breaking proverbial bonds.
Yes.
But now that you know that you are no longer in that story path, how does that change everything else in your life?
Well, one of the interesting things is what it does change and what it doesn't change. So, what it does change is that level of confidence and enjoying that label of like, no, I'm an athlete. I'm a weightlifter. I'm a strength athlete, right? And now 13 years later, 12 years later, turning 53. So I guess it's 13 years later. 13 years later, It's changed some of my patterns. I still lift regularly. I have a group that I work out with that are some of my very favorite humans. We also tend to get tacos after workouts a
I
couple of
love
times,
this group.
couple
I'm
of
gonna
times a month.
join it.
Like a great workout and then tacos, it's like heaven,
Heaven.
um, with good girlfriends. So, and just in general, that notion of getting clear about strength being critical both for my mental health and for my physical health is very exciting.
Mhm,
Interestingly, what it didn't change is the factual reality of my story of not an athlete. I still don't have very good hand-eye coordination at all. So I can train that a little bit because almost everything that's a weakness of ours is secretly a skill, which means that you can learn it a little bit more.
mhm,
Um, and I can push myself just for the joy of pushing myself and for the joy of, like, hey, here's something I'm not good at. Let's challenge myself. And then you feel better. It actually gives you a dopamine release when you try new things that are hard, just for the act of trying them.
mhm.
But it's interesting because and I think this is one of the things that's important for us to talk about is, like, that factual reality of I have terrible hand-eye coordination, still true, because it's actually a factual reality, but it doesn't have to become a negative story.
Right.
And so this is the invitation that I have for your audience is slow down and take a look. What are the stories you're telling yourself? Sometimes they might even be true.
Mhm.
Lots of times they're embellished by our emotions, or they're embellished by one or two negative experiences, and we forget to look at all of the positive experiences that we've had that contradict the story.
Right. Interesting. One of the things that I noticed on your website is the EMDR.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm fascinated by this because I do believe that everything's a construct, right? So our brains put everything together. So if something tragic happens, say in our youth, say as an adult, whatever it is, say it's yeah, something tragic happens, your brain stops and I need you to like correlate all this in doctor speak, but your brain stops functioning the way that it should and growing that it should, as I
Right.
understand it. And then you don't get past that and you keep going back to that moment. So how does EMDR step in to kind of repathway that process so that you one can move forward, but two you handle things differently. And how does that all work? Because I'm very fascinated by this.
So EMDR is really cool. For those in your audience who don't know, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a very fancy way of saying that you are trying to renegotiate the way memory is stored. So when traumatic memories get stored in a way that makes them get stuck, which does not happen all the time, and it does not happen to everyone,
Hmm.
um, but there's certain brains and there's certain backgrounds that can increase your ability to get PTSD. Um, so when trauma gets stuck in a way that is not very helpful, it normally is looping. And so even when you're trying to move forward, you keep getting stuck in the loop of the negative memory that happened. And that
Hmm.
tends to be associated with negative thoughts about yourself. So those stories that you're telling yourself, negative emotions, and difficult body sensations. And EMDR is really interesting because it takes a look at the variety of different places that we store memory. So we tend to have an overarching incident, which is kind of the overarching story of what has happened. There's the worst part sensory memory. So this is where when you close your eyes, you can see a movie of this, or you can hear someone's awful thing that they said to you. Occasionally it's tactile, so it's something that you felt. Occasionally it is something that you smelled or tasted. But most of the time, the way that we store sensory memory is either in like pictures or movies or in auditory remembrances. And then we take a look at those emotions that are associated and the body sensations that are associated. And the way that I describe it is almost like you have a broken mirror, but all the pieces are scattered throughout your house. And in EMDR, it goes and collects all of the pieces and puts them together and kind of knits the mirror back together. And then you can choose to file it so that then it's not constantly, you're not constantly slipping on something and cutting yourself on this old memory. Instead, if you wish to take it out, you can, but you don't have to.
So how does that work? Like, what is the technical science behind it? I'm just because I think a lot of people are like, that sounds like voodoo math. So
Yep.
how do you, I guess, how do you describe how that actually, I mean, your description is beautiful, but like the technical description of how it rewires, how does that happen?
So the technical description, to be most honest, is that we don't totally understand it.
Okay.
What we have hundreds of articles that demonstrate that EMDR is effective and that it lasts. What we don't totally get is the mechanism behind which it works. My personal belief that I think there's some both theory that supports this belief and maybe some research that supports it. I believe it consciously activates our REM sleep system,
Okay.
and our REM sleep system is where we are encoding memory. So that is what I believe that it does. What I say to my clients all the time is our brains don't really understand the difference between a well-developed visual and reality. So if we can give our brains a well-developed visual, that's really helpful to help us move forward. And I believe EMDR taps into some of that.
Hmm.
Does that
And
make some sense?
it does, it does. I'm curious, there's a new science out too, and it's more tonal. So it's the
Mhm.
playing the tones. What's the difference between the two?
So the tonal stuff, my understanding is that it's renegotiating the harmonics in your body and it's resetting some of the harmonics. And that is taking a look at some of our electrical signals, and that seems to help, that rebalancing that seems to help rebalance our nervous systems.
Hmm.
I don't know how much EMDR works directly on our nervous systems, but certainly what I observe in doing the work, which I've been doing now for 20 years, um, is that folks come in very activated. And by the end of an EMD, a completed EMDR process, they're so much more relaxed in their body. And they have found and put a traumatic memory and the associated issues with it into storage in a way that leaves them back in control instead of the memory being the thing that's driving their behavior.
So what type of person, I mean, I I've been in and out of therapy for probably 30 years, right? And then
Yep.
I've got friends who have, tried different things and done different things. Who's best suited for EMDR? Who's most successful when they go through the process?
So the cool thing about EMDR, and this is my data, not I don't know the national results of this, but my data in my practice is EMDR works moderately to significantly well for about 80% of the people who try it. I get mild results for 15%,
Hmm.
and then 5% it just doesn't appear to work for. And those brains typically have something very, very neurodivergent. So they have a seizure disorder or they have substantial learning difficulties. So, but for the average person, EMDR is pretty darn effective. And the people who do best, at least in my practice with it, they're coming in with one of two things. One, they're coming in with a substantial trauma that occurred, either individual trauma, you were raped once, or long-term trauma, you were sexually abused over a lengthy period of time. Sometimes the individual trauma is something like a plane crash or a car accident. So the traumas you can come in either a single incident trauma or something that traumatic occurrences that happened over time, or folks are coming in with very substantial negative thoughts that are not necessarily, they might have been true years ago, but they aren't helpful anymore, right? So one of those
Hmm.
negative thoughts might be like, I can't trust anyone. Maybe that was really helpful when you were growing up in a super chaotic home, but now as an adult, it's just screwing you up,
Hmm.
right? Um, Other negative thoughts, I'm worthless. I'm unlovable, right? Those negative thoughts, and typically they're related to traumatic experiences or a
Right.
series of difficult experiences. Um, but those negative thoughts are in their way, and EMDR really helps get those negative thoughts out of your way.
How long does it typically take? I know, so we're at such the society now where it's like, okay, I want the quick pill. I want my
Yep.
Ozempic to be thin and I want, whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's like everybody wants to hack the hacking nation, right? We want to
Yep.
hack everything. So how long does it typically take? Like, on a normal scale, we're not, I mean, even if there is like a traumatic event, like a car crash that's affected you for years, how long does EMDR typically take to really kind of reset that bar and restabilize your system so that you can move on and kind of have a different perspective on life?
Depends on what you're bringing in. For single incident trauma, I've had multiple clients who've been in small plane crashes.
Hmm.
You need 1 to 3 sessions of EMDR for
Okay.
that incident. For folks with a much larger, broader trauma history, I'm averaging seeing them 12 sessions.
Okay.
So it ranges, but part of the reason I chose personally to get trained in EMDR is it's just a lot faster than traditional talk therapy. So any of the somatic approaches, there's several of them that have been developed. I'm trained in EMDR, but there's a bunch of different ones. Um, they tend to work a little faster. I believe they work faster because you aren't just dealing with your thoughts. You're dealing with your thoughts and your feelings, and then the physiological load of that. And when you deal with all three of those things at the same time, it seems to facilitate the speed of treatment.
Interesting. And I'm curious, and I have a whole bunch more questions, but I'm curious about what direction the science is going now, because I think the brain is fascinating and the mind is fascinating in that we just don't know all
Yep,
that we don't know. And if
so
we're
much.
only using a small portion of our brain, there's so much more that our brain is capable of. Why is it there if we're not using all of it? Like, what's left? What don't we know? What direction is therapy going in, as far as traumatic therapy going in? Are there any new advances that are being made in understanding, how to remap your brain and how to grow?
And I'm sure there are lots of them that I don't even know about. The thing that I have been paying the most attention to, and I've started getting some training in for myself, both for myself personally and then to be able to give to my clients, is in resetting nervous system. So I think that's sort of one of the hottest things that people are talking about these days. They're even doing like vagal nerve stretches and things like that. But
What is your vagal nerve? I don't even know what that is. That sounds like a different podcast.
Yeah, it's a whole different podcast, but essentially it's a nerve that runs it's a series, it's a nerve bundle, nerve cluster, I don't know what the right terminology is, that runs through your whole body
Okay.
that connects your essentially your body and your brain together
Okay.
and activates either your rest and digest system or your fight, flight, freeze mechanism, right? So are you relaxed and able to field the world, or are you under threat and you need to be vigilantly protecting yourself? And
Hmm.
so the more, one of the major problems is that things like traffic now activate that threat response system, but it's just traffic.
Hmm.
It is actually an inconvenience. No one is coming at you with a knife,
Nobody died. Right.
right?
Right.
Now, a car hurtling towards you that's trying to run you off the road, that actually should be threatening. But sitting in rush hour traffic and just feeling inconvenienced, our brain is processing that in very similar ways. And unfortunately, that's not great for us
Hmm.
because we have all of these threats that are coming up all the time. Except for really, we're fine. We're safer. We are often safer than we give ourselves credit for. So, getting into that sense of safety, settling your nervous system on purpose, I think is a very fruitful and interesting piece of the research and the practical application and the clinical application these days that I think is very exciting.
I think it's very interesting. While you were talking, I was thinking about social media and I've had to pull myself off of social media, like physically, because
Yep.
I will get so emotive, and
Yes.
it's not my fight. It's not my, like, the things that I'm getting worked up about. I don't even know if I'm like worked up about a bot. I don't know. You know what I mean? So
Right.
how how have you noticed social media affecting your patients? Are your patient, am I the only one who is like
Nope.
emotionally engaged and like ready to go to town on whatever nonsense is happening here in our great state of Colorado?
Yeah. Well, in general, we have moved from, if you go back old school and you used to listen to the nightly news.
Hmm.
First of all, the news was on twice a day
Hmm.
for brief periods of time. And the news was delivered in the tone of voice like this. Whether it was something very exciting or it was something very difficult, the news was delivered in a neutral delivery, emphasis on facts.
Hmm.
Right? At some point, and I'm sure there's people who can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, at some point, selling the news became very important. And we now have 24-hour news cycles
Hmm.
going all the time. And the only reason, the only method, not the only reason, the only method to make that profitable is to get people engaged. And to get them engaged, the best way to do that is to get them upset and outraged.
Hmm.
And so now what we have as news delivery is actually mostly opinion based. Its facts seem to be extremely
Irrelevant.
debatable,
Irrelevant. Hmm.
right? And politicized, which is interesting. And on top of it, the delivery itself has all the hallmarks of uncivil communication. We are name calling. We are using tones of voice that are far from neutral. We are being manipulative and difficult in our deliveries. And we are pitting people against each other. And then social media then takes all of that and puts it on repeat and makes it larger. And on
Hmm.
top of it, now we have like, are you arguing with a bot? Maybe, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Is that picture actually faked? Maybe,
Right.
right? So facts have become very elusive, opinions have become very loud, and it's really not good for human brains.
Right. I agree. I think there's I can't be the only one who's just got to pull off. Like, it's
You are
just
not the only one.
ridiculous. Sad. Sad. And then when I'm thinking of like the development of your path as far as taking, your clinical work and then shifting into the corporate space,
Mhm.
how is that flow? I mean, are you working with individuals within corporations, or are you helping to train and guide whole teams? How does that work for you?
Little bit of both. So it's interesting. I know I have several friends who were in the therapy realm and they've totally given up being therapists and they've either become professional speakers or coaches and they've given up the practice of therapy.
Why?
I I still love individual therapy. I think it's phenomenal. I'm consistently honored and humbled by my clients coming in and talking to me about the things that they are talking to me about. I love to help individuals, but I have such fun, good, easy to implement psychologically minded information. Several years ago, I was like, I've got to get out in front of more people. So I'm still working with individuals and often an individual who's running a big corporation or something like that. And they're coming in, they want to develop themselves personally, and then they want to bring that into their workplace. That is totally my jam. Um, but I also really enjoy training the teams. And so it's just taking the information that I have that I've been delivering to an individual and broadening the scope of it. So the speaking and the training piece is very exciting.
So when corporations are looking to bring you in, what are they typically looking to attach to you for?
They are looking to help their employees perform better. They're looking for less conflict on their teams, and they are looking for how can management and the folks that report to them, how can they more smoothly work together? Because I think particularly during COVID, we got a little bit into this notion of like either the employees were feeling bullied by the management or the management was feeling bullied by the employees. And so getting everyone out of victim mode and back into some collaborative civil conversations and moving forward from like, what are the actual values in the workplace? What are the personal values? How do you link that to action? So all of that actually helps teams get along better, understand each other better, and communicate in ways that are less hokey.
How do you do
Right.
that with hybrid teams?
That's the thing that's interesting is you have to be a little bit more um not necessarily open, but you have to be a little bit more deliberate in your communication. And if some people are in person, you're going to get a lot more cues, right?
Hmm.
The nonverbals that we can see in person far exceed the nonverbals that you can see in a Zoom room.
Right.
So helping folks get more deliberate about their communication and also setting some of the standards so that uh, one of the most basic ones, come on a meeting and show your face,
Hmm.
right?
I don't like to, but I understand why you should.
And here's why
I
you
mean,
should, right? Like, and sometimes it's actually helpful to have the power brokers be, if there's, let's say there's 15 people in a meeting and there's 5 people who are really the folks who are presenting and they're working with things and they're the ones who are sort of in charge,
mhm.
they definitely need their faces on. And then the folks who are in and listening and gathering information, sometimes you can do that without having your face on. But a lot of times, what happens when folks don't have their face on is then they're multitasking. I'm
Like I
sure
just got outed a little bit, but yes.
not
I mean,
right. But the problem with multitasking is actually our brains don't multitask very well.
fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this notion of slowing down and really paying attention, and one of my most common refrains is only schedule a meeting if it's actually really important,
Mm. Mhm.
right? So a piece of this is decrease the number of meetings, decrease the amount of time they take. Ensure that you're giving enough time in between meetings to do things like we're now calling it take a bio break. You have to go to the bathroom.
I know, just get up and go.
Right?
I mean, this isn't
You have
high
to go to the
school,
bathroom.
right?
This is okay. But so we have this like over scheduling, we have so much pressure.
Mhm.
And so helping particularly virtual teams get a little bit more clear about like, what are we meeting about? Why is it critically important? What's your expectation for participation? And and eliminating that notion of like, oh, well, I'm doing all of this work, but I'm listening to you, but I'm doing all this work.
Mhm.
Right? It's like, no, be here, be present, then disconnect from that, then get to the work.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
People don't love this idea, but
No, I mean, I agree with it wholeheartedly. I just this is one for thee and not me. But yeah, no, I totally agree. I think especially in the workplace, it's so easy to do too many things too often
yes.
because it seems like it's that urgency, right? We've got to get everything done. We've got to get it done yesterday and
Yeah.
we've got to do it again tomorrow. And so it's hard, I think, for a lot of people to just kind of look, this is my pace. This is my pace, and this is when we're going to get there, and this is how it's going to happen. And we all just kind of need to get back to normalizing pace. But
Well, and I'm also kind of imploring employers to pay attention to some of the research, right? Like if we take a look at the research, hybrid actually works pretty well. It has a lot of strengths and not quite as many weaknesses. 100% work from home hybrid, sometimes that has some real difficulty, right? Like in terms
Mhm.
of team interaction and things like that, it's just harder to do
Mhm.
for just
Especially
the
with
work.
younger teams, I think, because
Yep.
younger teams haven't developed their workflow. They haven't really developed their connections. They just haven't developed,
Yep.
right? And so that's just me advocating for older people can stay home. But go on.
Well, but also this notion of 100% in the office has some stress to it, especially for folks who are trying to pay for childcare,
Mhm.
or they're folks who are having difficulty with transportation, things like that. So acknowledging some of that and helping people get their admin stuff done when they're offline at home, whatever, that's fine, as long as they're getting their work done, right? But it is interesting. Employees do the best when they have a level of autonomy.
Mhm.
Tons of micromanagement crushes morale, and then it decreases performance. So a piece of what I bring in when I go and work with employers and with teams is like, let's take a look at what, again, back to this notion of acknowledging reality.
Mhm.
What is really working here and what isn't? Why, and there's a company that I'm aware of that just recently made a move to having everyone come back in person, except for there's one person who lives close to the new office.
Mhm.
Everyone else now has a 45 or an hour commute. And the resentment level is like,
Mhm.
right? And this is the thing. We're trying to pretend that we can make everything fair, except for that is generally very difficult to
Right.
achieve. And the thing is that everybody knows it's the one person who's driving this decision and it meets their needs, but it doesn't meet everybody else's.
Mhm.
So it's like slowing down and looking at what is really going on and to not be afraid to tell the truth about reality. And then from there, figure out what are the pros and cons,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So if
Interesting.
reality is we do want some in-person interaction. Okay, that's really important. Let's make sure that happens. But if the reality also is that employees are really resentful about a commute, let's put that on the table as a factual reality as well. And then let's see how we work around it.
Right.
Now,
Right.
obviously, one of my best friends is a night nurse. She's never going to get to work from home.
Right, right. Well, I mean,
Right?
some jobs, some roles just do not allow for it. In a lot
Some
of
roles do
cases,
not.
in a lot of cases, most cases, you have to be in the office.
Yep.
And that's just the nature of work, but that's also the nature and the choice of the work that you choose to do.
Right.
So some of that does come down to maybe you need to personally align a little bit better. You need to understand where you are in the world and then adjust to that as opposed to making your employer adjust to that. And
Yes.
then, that personal responsibility, I think we've kind of lost a little bit of that too. Now, it seems as if everyone expects everyone else to adjust to us individually. And I think sometimes we need to do that for ourselves.
Well, and systematically, that has been a cultural shift that we've made. Not even sure over how many years, but I would say that it's a disastrous one.
Hmm.
Me expecting you to behave in a certain way so that I'm comfortable is always going to be a losing proposition because that's me giving away all of my power. It's also typically poorly communicated.
Hmm.
Right? Like, so how we mostly know ourselves is actually covert to other people because we mostly know things that are happening inside our own brains. We're really clear what our intentions are, right? We know what we're thinking,
Hmm.
but not communicating that, we have to make that overt to the world. And so it's a very difficult and very interesting path that we're on right now, where I need you to know before I've told you, and if I have to tell you, then you're doing something wrong.
Right.
You need to know what's inside my head and accommodate it. And I don't have any responsibility to communicate it, but I will get incredibly outraged if you don't accommodate me. That's a terrible way. Number one, it's a
Hmm.
terrible way to treat yourself because you've given away all your power. But number two, it's a horrendous way to treat other people
Hmm.
because it makes communication a trick. Right? And
Right. It's so
communication is supposed to
manipulative.
be a collaborative exercise where two people can come together and it's okay to be two different people. That's
Right.
actually okay.
Well, I noticed too, there's a trend towards not only do you have to know what I want and you have to communicate and respond to me the way that I want, but you also have to accept and almost champion against your values what I want you to see. So you have to change your values to accommodate my feelings, even
Yep.
though I may not be a central figure in your life. And I don't understand where necessarily that shift happened, but it seems to be very prevalent, not only in, in work, but in personal life and especially online. Online, you're meant to know exactly what people you've never met feel and think, and you should be totally accepting and change who you are to accept that.
Yeah, and that's a lousy way to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most difficult pieces about that is it eliminates curiosity. And eliminating curiosity means that it's really difficult to get along.
Mm-hmm.
Because if everyone is needs to be in these very rigid, narrow boxes so that they feel comfortable, first of all, it's violating that first principle that we talked about a while ago, which is that we have to actually work with the reality that we have, and there's strengths and weaknesses to just about everything. So, and one of the things that we know, the research is outstandingly clear on this. If we would like to make a change or to grow or to move forward, we are inevitably going to feel uncomfortable in that process at some point, probably through much of it. And so, this insistence that we have in our culture right now that I feel comfortable all the time, and it's your responsibility to make me comfortable. First of all, that means that you're probably not growing, because if you're never going to be uncomfortable, then you're never going to be doing something new or different or forward moving,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
And it just simply, so we're, as a psychologist, I keep feeling like we're violating the basics of reasonable critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, we've moved into very fundamentalist thinking, interestingly, on both ends of the political spectrum. But we've moved into this acceptance of and indulgence in fundamentalist thinking. And frankly, I think fundamentalist thinking is fundamentally bad for people.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed. But it closes the door. And I think the most frustrating as a communicator, the most frustrating thing is that you cannot communicate freely. There's no exchange of
right,
ideas. It's a
right.
completely accept this. This is the path. We
Yep.
won't discuss it because if we discuss it, you're wrong and I'm offended and I'm going to call foul,
Yep.
which is horrible. It's so damaging to the entire community and the global community. It breaks me a little bit. I'm not sure how to fix or amend that, but
Well, my suggestion to people is to actually stop playing that game.
hmm
So number one, it's to check in with yourself, right? Because if
hmm
we're the only ones we have control over, and sometimes that's really dubious, right?
right.
But first is check in with yourself. Where are you insisting that someone agree with you so that you feel comfortable?
hmm
And can you breathe through that and actually try to hear someone out who has a different opinion? Can you expose yourself to different opinions? Can you ask with some curiosity about somebody's values? I mean, one of the things that I think is super interesting, I think Mark Manson is a blogger and author who writes about this very, just in a really comprehensive way. But one of the things that we know is that if you actually poll the American public, we are in more agreement than disagreement
hmm
by a long shot.
hmm
And several of the most hot political issues that were given one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum about, like 70% of Americans are looking for a middle ground solution.
hmm
And we aren't getting an opportunity to do that. And a piece of what is happening is that we're getting afraid to say anything. And censorship like that is really difficult. So my, sort of general approach to that, first of all, is to challenge myself to be a more flexible thinker,
hmm
and then to ask and teach my clients how to be more flexible as well.
Right.
And it's really interesting when folks get back into that, it's really enjoyable because it's back to fun, curiosity, jokes, like the
It's more
humor community, I think,
relaxed.
has gotten so canceled.
Oh, I
Um,
know. I hate cancel culture in its entirety. I hate all of it. I'd rather be offended and have the conversation. And I'll actually let me roll this back a little bit. One of the reasons I started the channel and one of the reasons I started the podcast is to have those conversations, to
yeah,
remind everybody that we are, especially going through the 24-hour, 24 forever political cycle that we're in.
Yep.
And then also because, as we get older, it seems like we're not allowed to speak anymore. Okay, women kind of get put into a nice little bucket over here. We're old, we're,
Yep.
past our childbearing years, we must be idiots. So let's not talk to you anymore. And I don't think that's true. I think more than ever,
Nope.
we have this amazing place where we've experienced a lot of things, but also we're still very active. We're still very engaged. We're still very opinionated, and we have a lot of wisdom to share. And so to me, the cancel culture is such a unhealthy. I'd rather you offend me and we laugh about it later than sit in my corner and pretend like I'm right all the time. I know I'm wrong a lot of the time, but I enjoy the conversation. So, yeah.
Well, and here's one of the things that's interesting. And employers are complaining regularly about some of their younger employees having very brittle presentations. They're
Mhm.
very fragile, they're very brittle, they're having a difficult time at work. Um, and a piece of this insistence on comfort, again, has stripped us of our resilience.
Mhm.
So if we can get back to being curious, enabling difference instead of insisting that everything is the same, because it's not. Um, and and being able to tell the truth about what's really going on, all of that actually enables resilience. If you're walking into something with the notion of like, I've got this, even if I don't know what's going to happen next, that brings you in a totally different way than, oh, I'm only going to be okay if this is our, is interesting. This a notion of like safe rooms and trigger words and all of that is actually systematically stripping us of resilience and grit and the ability to bounce back. And it's making
Agreed.
things that just used to be normal parts of life
Mhm.
have now become labeled traumatic. And it's also stripping the meaning from what real trauma is
Right.
and again, making us less resilient, have less grit, less able to bounce back. So when we are in a curious, flexible, forward moving, these are words I'll use a lot over and over again. Like that approach is a strong, beautiful, comprehensive way of looking at the world. The more narrow we get, the more brittle and rigid we get, the more fragile we are. So it's interesting being able to look at the truth of our own strengths and weaknesses, the truth of what is, the reality of what is actually happening and what's working well and not working well, then you have some power to do something about it. If things can only look like this, then you're spending all your time and energy defending against what you don't want instead of having that just be a part of what happens,
Sounds so
right?
exhausting. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think if we can impart any part of that to the younger generation, boys and girls, like it, whatever you
Oh,
want to,
yep, yep. This is
whatever.
this is this
This is
crosses genders.
right. It's non-denominational. So
Yep.
I think if we can impart that upon them and help them grow, do you recommend? And one of the things I've considered and thought about is mentoring within the workplace across different
Yeah.
functionalities. So you've got, say somebody from marketing mentoring somebody from admin or whatever it is,
Yeah.
so that you've got
Awesome.
different people, just so that you're one talking to someone outside of your peer group,
Yep.
right? But also so that you're having the ability to create bonds and also guide from
Yep.
a broader spectrum, a broader perspective.
Absolutely. And I also think in general, it that mentoring is best set up on common values and related standards, right? So if you actually say, we value diversity of opinion here, that means that everyone doesn't have to agree, but we're going to disagree in a way that is civil and respectful.
Hmm.
So that the value of, we value diversity of opinion. The standard is that we then are curious and interested in someone else's point of view instead of immediately going to offense. And
Hmm.
so those values are the foundational piece. The standards are standards are what I call workplace boundaries.
Sure.
So the standards that then we do this from, and then here's how it looks in action. It's building that house of positive communication on a solid foundation of what the values are of the company, and then the standards of how those values are played out.
I think that's important because it gives a different perspective, but it also empowers you with connection.
Yep.
So I think both of those things are important. But I do think it's important to work on yourself first and bring
Yep.
yourself at your A game. I noticed you have this 2024 habits workbook. Talk me through
I
this.
do.
I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk about
Yep.
your book. So talk me at like how did this creation come to be, and who's it best for, and how do we use it, and yeah, let's talk about it.
Absolutely. So the habits workbook is building on, again, that foundational principle of psychological flexibility.
Mhm.
So what's most important to us? Let's move forward from our values and let's link our values to actual concrete actions. So we aren't just thinking about something, we have thought about something, and then we have said, and here's what we're going to do next,
Mhm.
right? Because implementation is very different than intention. Intention is lovely, but we can spend so much time looping in our thoughts, right? And not actually moving forward. So we want to
Right.
be moving forward. So the workbook, um, is just a reminder to my clients and my colleagues and my email list and all of that. And myself, I filled out the workbook myself. But is like, what are our core values for this year? What are our core priorities for this year? And then what are the actions on a daily basis that move us towards success? So it just gets it written down. I think it's a lovely thing to take a look at each quarter.
Mhm.
And decide what your focus is on for that quarter. Um,
So when you're coaching people on how to create those goals and establish those goals, what are some examples of actionable goals that are reasonable to create for the year on an individual level, and what are not good examples? So what are we how do you coach to, okay, that's not what we're looking for. So people understand when they step in and start building out their book, and understanding where they're going.
yep.
Right.
So let's take health. We'll take health as a value. Lovely. Then the priority on health, let's say the priority on health this year is improving your nutrition. So this is more concrete.
Hmm.
And then the actions that are going to go with that is that you are going to make a commitment to work out 4 to 5 days a week. You're going to make a commitment to, I'm a weightlifter, so I make a commitment to like eating a certain number of grams of protein, right, in a
Hmm.
day. And then I track that on a daily and weekly basis and then go back and compare that to my value of health, every month, every quarter, whatever your time frame is. So similarly, you can make this for a business goal. You want to increase your gross revenue, right? So then you're going to take a look at, and the value is success. So you start with the value is success. Then what does success look like? Let's make it more concrete. And then let's divide it into, does this mean that you're going to be cutting expenses? Does this mean that you're going to be increasing efficiency? Will this mean that you're making X number of sales calls in a week? Like, then you put in the actual actions,
Hmm.
but a goal like feel better. What's the underlying value? What's the driver of it? And then how do you make it concrete? And then how do you divide that into actions that you can actually track,
Hmm. What is
right?
the science behind the success of setting goal lists? Because I know that they're coached and they're taught, and
Yep.
in so many different ways you should be doing some sort of markers for yourself so that you can stay on this path. But is there actual science behind it?
So my understanding of the science is that just setting a goal increases your likelihood of achieving it at a very high rate. I can't remember the exact stat. I think it's 80, 87%, something like that, right? So
Hmm.
just the act of setting the goal increases your likelihood of reaching it, which is fantastic.
Hmm.
And then if you go back to the general research of that supports the concept of psychological flexibility, having something that you are actually regularly assessing helps give you information about, like, am I moving in the right trajectory
Hmm.
or am I over here somehow? Because this happens to us a lot, right? Has anybody ever set a New Year's resolution and
Mhm.
it's really important to you and it seems really critical and you know that you want to be here. But the next thing you know, all of your behavior is over here,
Mhm.
right? So this is the reasoning behind goal setting is to take a look at like how close are you, where are your waypoints, and then to also assess whether or not it's realistic,
Right.
right?
Right. Now, when you set a goal, and this is an interesting direction too, when you set a goal, so say you can, whatever it is, I'm not going to eat sugar, right?
Sure.
Because I want to be healthier, because I want to be in better shape or whatever your end goal is, right? And then you're going through your day and that habit kicks in.
Yep.
And that habit is stronger than I think people give resonance
Credit
to,
for. Yeah.
because it's almost like the autonomic sense of you just go through your day and this is what you do and this is how you do it, and so that sugar
Yes.
plays in. So how do you coach to breaking to that habit, because that habit is a tricky little fellow and seems to jump in when you're not paying attention, when you think you've got strength and you're doing your thing, and this goes not just towards sugar but any goal that you're setting. That habit will jump in and kind of throw you off base.
Well, our brains are designed for efficiency, and the brain's definition of efficiency is an extremely low bar. Did it kill you the last time you tried, right? Or did it almost kill you the
Let's
last
try
time,
harder the next time, kids.
right?
You're right.
So our brains are literally wired to repeat what we have repeated previously.
Right.
So when we are making a new habit, part of this, again, back to that word flexibility, is we have to notice when we break it. And then
Mhm.
we have to repeat the new habit multiple times. The research on this has gotten really confusing because it used to be 21, then it was 30. Then some people will say, oh no, you have to do it 100 times. So I don't know exactly what the correct number is, right? Like, because the research keeps changing.
Right. And it could be variable by
That.
human. So,
But the answer is you have to do it many more times than once. And it's most helpful when you've replaced the old habit with something new. So, for example, if you want to give up, let's say you want to give up sugar. Great. Number one, how serious do you want to be about this? Right? Like, does this mean that you're not even going to have ketchup because it's going to have a little bit of sugar in it? Or does it mean that you're just not eating a piece of cake every night?
mhm.
Right? So defining the goal and then figuring out what's reasonable. And then my general recommendation to folks is if you can get it right about 80% of the time, you're winning.
I like an
So
80% goal.
not perfection.
Right.
For the perfectionists, I encourage that you strive for 90%, right? But for the rest of us, 80%, somewhere between 80 and 90%, you're winning. This is awesome. And figure out what your new habit is going to get associated with. So, most of the time when we have habits, it's not something that we do all day long. Normally, there's a time window or it's attached to something,
Mhm.
right? Last night we were out at a benefit dinner. It was lovely, actually, and we didn't eat dessert. And on the way home, realized like, oh, I'm craving dessert.
Mhm.
Except we had made a commitment a little while ago, beginning of this year, that we were going to stop eating so late. We were finding that it's disrupting our sleep. It's just, we're getting empty calories. It's just not the healthiest thing for us. And so, but we're on our way home. It's 9:30 at night and I'm craving something sweet. And the answer was just to sit with it, right?
I agree totally. And most of the time, and sugar's a bad example because I can ignore sugar, but there
Yeah.
are things where, I smoked for years and then stopped. But for
Oh,
people who
smoking is so
have the
hard to give up.
panic, it's not just the craving, it's the
Yep.
panic associated with the craving. How can you work towards rewiring yourself against the panic?
Well, so a piece of it is acknowledging that the panic is there instead of berating yourself for the panic being there. Right?
Okay.
So, like, literally just, like, breathe through it, ground through it, and figure out what other options you have. So if we continue with the sugar, although this would work with smoking as well, pop a piece of gum in your mouth, right? You need something? Okay. Acknowledge that you need something. Pop a piece of gum in your, and acknowledge that you feel uncomfortable. And then give yourself that permission to feel uncomfortable and to stay uncomfortable for a minute. And almost any strong emotion passes in only a few minutes if we acknowledge that it exists. It's when we are resisting it and trying to shove it down, and then we're lambasting ourselves like we're not okay, or telling ourselves a big story. I'm so weak because I said I was going to give this up, and now I want it, right? Like cutting through all of that. Oh, I feel really uncomfortable right now. I really want a cigarette right now.
So it sounds
Okay.
like you're saying you need to be able to control the narrative that is going on in your head and your body.
And it's not even controlling it, it's acknowledging what it is.
Okay.
And then, because we really can't control our thoughts. I think that's a big misnomer, is this idea that we can control what's going to come up next in our heads, or we're going to control our next feeling. Like, it isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
If someone has a gun to your head right now and says, I'll pull the trigger if you feel anxious, how are you
Yeah.
not going to feel anxious, right? How
Right.
can you demand that you don't feel anxious? It's
Right.
not. Similarly, it was funny. I was at an event recently, and they were doing this manufactured joy thing, which I really don't. I do not personally enjoy. Some people love it, but this manufactured joy, it feels really disingenuous to me because
Mm-hmm.
it's demanding that you feel joyful right now because I told you you have to. I don't know. I just don't really. That doesn't resonate with me.
Right. Huh. Interesting. Interesting. So tell
So
me
it
about,
isn't. So it's not demanding that a certain thing come up or demanding that you can control it. Instead, it's just acknowledging that that's a piece of the process, right? You're giving something up, you're going to feel uncomfortable.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ownership of it too. Just
Yeah,
accepting. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. So tell me about self-help on the go.
Oh my gosh, Self-Help on the Go is the book that I wrote because my clients were super tired of 250-page, one topic self-help books. They would come in and they'd put these books on my desk. They're very generous, right? They're like, please give this to somebody else. It's just not working for me. I don't need to know why this is happening. I just need to know what to do the next time my boss is being a jerk, right? So
Okay.
it is 10 chapters with 10 common problems we run into: anxiety, depression, anger, stress, relationships, communication. All of these things we end up regularly running into roadblocks or running into obstacles. And so each chapter has 10 suggestions for common problem areas that you're likely to run into, and it has 10 suggestions per problem area. And most of the suggestions are things that you can try right in the very minute that you're reading it. And one of the cool things about Self-Help on the Go is you do not need to start at the beginning and read it all the way until the end. You literally turn to the chapter that you're struggling with, read through a couple of the tips, and decide which one you want to give a try to.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Easy, effective. Yeah.
I love it. I
Well,
love it.
well tested. 99 of my favorite things that my clients have told me work really well for them.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. I love that. And so anyone who's trying to find you in the greater Denver area and or online, we'll put links in the show notes, but can you tell us where to find you for those who are
Ab-
driving or whatever?
Absolutely. Selfhelponthego.com. And that will take you and give you information about my speaking. About if you're interested in therapy, it will kick you over to my therapy website. If you're interested in the book, there's a link to get the book, selfhelponthego.com.
Perfect, perfect. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation very much. So I want to
Me
thank you
too.
for jumping on with me and hopefully we'll do it again soon. And yeah, thank you so much. Is there anything
Absolutely.
else I didn't ask you that I should have?
I don't think so. This is a really comprehensive, awesome
I know.
conversation.
It's been great. I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrie. And we hope to connect with you again soon.
That sounds great.